Okay, so the recording has started and we can get going. So the focus for this evening is the on-the-water duties of umpires, marshal starters, and aligners. So our agenda is as follows. We'll do some background prior to getting to the on-water officials. Then we will look at the marshal, the starter, the umpire, and the pilot together with the umpire, and then I will take any outstanding questions. So in terms of background, as officials, there are two documents which are very valuable to us, and everybody should be very familiar with them. The first is the rules of racing specific to South Africa. And those were updated in 2020. You can find them on the ROSA website. And there's the handbook for rowing officials. That's a little bit more dated. It was updated in 2015. But it is being overhauled as we speak. Okay, and yeah, in particular, with respect to the things we're going to be discussing tonight, the handbook is silent on the role of the starter. Actually, so is the rules of racing. They both assume that the starter and the umpire's roles are combined, but it's really important that we understand that what happens when those roles are separated. Right, so as officials, I'm sure everybody has heard this many times, but yeah, our principles and the things that we worry about officials are two things. First, safety, and second, fairness. And safety comes first. So there's no point in having a fair regatta if it's unsafe. So we have to worry about safety first and then fairness. So I'm going to discuss fairness first. So the fairness from the officials' point of view is that we will ensure the rules of racing are applied fairly and that we have an atmosphere of respect to all competitors. From the competitors' perspective, they need to compete fairly, show respect for their opponents and for regatta officials, and in particular, be at the start on time and follow instructions of the officials at all times, both on and off the water. I hope our rowers are more on time than our officials are this evening when joining this training. Anyway, so let's then get to safety. What's the most important thing we as officials need to know before getting on the water? Anybody want to have it a guess? Indeed, we cannot get onto the water without this. So the most important thing to know before we even think about getting onto the water are what are the traffic rules for the event that we are participating in or we're officiating in. So here, for instance, are the traffic rules for the Allen Francis Rowing Course. They're slightly dated, so please ignore these bits up here. That's changed. The good thing is that all of these rules are on a board at the venue, and so please, especially for the newbies, and before you get on the water, you must check what the rules for that particular venue are. Okay, and why do we say that this is so important? Well, what happens when two boats collide head on? So if we think about it, an 8 in its own right weighs more than 100 kilos, but it has 8 people on board, each of which could be weighing around 80 kilos. plus a coxswain. So in total, it'll get to 750 kilos very easily. So this is 3/4 of a ton. When you've got a boat moving at 20 kilometers an hour and it goes head first into a boat coming in the opposite direction at 20 kilometers an hour, and you've got 1.5 tons worth of momentum in this, then people die, get seriously injured. So that's why we worry very much about the traffic rules at a regatta, and that's why we impose sanctions on crews who disobey the traffic rules, and that's why when we're speaking to coaches and so forth, we emphasize that even for their junior crews, they must be fully aware of the traffic rules at a regatta. So as officials, what do we worry about? We worry about crews on their way to the start, so they may not come onto the course. We worry about crews leaving the course at the end. And what's really important here is that they don't cross these traffic lanes of crews coming down. We've had incidents of that, not at this last regatta, but at the previous one. And then crews creating a danger after the race. So they might not obey the rules in the warm down area, or they may not row sufficiently far beyond the end of the race to be out of the way of the crews coming down for the next race. So those are all things that we need to worry about. So let's just look at a different course. This is VLC, and let's look at a scenario. And the scenario is that the crew wants to warm down after the race. In other words, they don't want to come back into the jetty. They want to warm down. So where do they go? So typically what the crew will do is they'll finish their race and they'll come this way. Now you can see the danger there. That's for crews who have missed their race and are coming in. So we've got potentially two crews rowing against each other. Yeah, and as we all know, boats, people go backwards in boats, so they can't see each other, and we have the potential for an accident. So, if I was a safety officer here, I would emphasize to crews that if they want to warm down, that they have to row all the way back up around the start and back again. And in the past, when we've done this, we haven't had any pushback from the crews. In fact, they're only too happy to have a nice long warm down. So what I think we're saying here is, when you look at the rules or the traffic rules of a venue, it's also important to think about them judiciously and to think about what these traffic rules are not saying and what could go wrong despite these traffic rules. Right. Now let's think about officials at the start, because that's mostly what we're going to be covering in this training tonight. So the first thing is that we have to realize that this is a very important moment for the rowers. They're likely to be tense and hyped up because of the start that's about to happen. So they'll be full of adrenaline and ready to go. And it's important for us as officials to assist the crews by showing professionalism and respect, and to be very calm and to communicate accurately. And when we communicate accurately, one of the chief culprits here is two officials telling the crews to do two different things. We cannot afford to give conflicting instructions to crews. One of the best ways around that is for the officials to stick to their role, unless the other official isn't present, when you can step into that role. But it really, it looks very bad and causes a lot of confusion if we have different officials giving the crews different instructions. The next thing is that we want to communicate clearly, so we need clear instructions. So it's important to speak slowly and audibly when using a loud hailer. And one of our recent innovations, which is the dedicated starter or start tower at Roodeplaat, this also assists with a calm, orderly start. So there's much less shouting and bellowing through loudhailers and so forth. And it also allows the starter and the marshal to work together and allow the umpire who's going to follow the race to focus on getting into the right position to follow the race without worrying about starting and flags and so on and so forth. So now let's get to the specific duties of the official. So let's first talk about the marshal. So the marshal's area of responsibility is this area past the aligner and the holding area. Now that holding area can be in different places depending on the course, and we'll see that in a moment. So that's the area that the marshal works in. What does the marshal do? So the first is that the marshal should rack and stack the crews in race groups. So the marshal queries crews as they approach the holding area, finds out who they are, and then puts them together with other crews in the same race. Now, exactly where that marshal will put them, that depends on a few other things that we'll cover in a minute. And then, as it gets closer to the start for that particular crew, make sure that that crew is close to the start and ready to be received by the starter. The marshal, of course, should be recording the crew's arrival so that the marshal knows, which crew's in which race and so forth. Then the marshal will hand over the crews to the starter. And the reason that handover there is in italics is there's no official handover of crews to the starter. But if the starter is the umpire and they've just arrived, then of course the marshal will say your crews are ready in this area here, and they're all there, and so forth. And then the marshal also checks for missing crews, looks around to see if they aren't somewhere in the hold area and so forth. So the marshal plays a very important role in terms of keeping things calm and orderly prior to the start and ensuring that the regatta runs on time. So now let's look at some scenarios which will help us understand in a bit more detail what the marshal needs to do. So here we have a scenario. It's South African Schools Championship Regatta, and we have a crosswind coming in from the side like this, and our holding area is here, and we're marshal at 1,000. What is likely to happen? Well, based on past experience, this is what's likely to happen. That all the crews will end up here in this bay. And we'll have the marshal and potentially the rescue being distracted from their major role. We'll have delays, and we will have crews getting caught up with each other, causing delays and so forth. So this is a very bad situation, and as marshals, something we should be taking steps to avoid. So what should happen? Well, what should happen is that the crews should be facing with their bows into the wind. And so why do we say that? So racing shells are highly optimized for going forward fast. And they can make gradual turns when going forward. Going backwards is hard, so backing down is, people who've been on the alignment boat would know, backing down is hard, and moving sideways is impossible. So the easiest thing for a crew to stay on station or stay in position when there's a wind is to ensure that their bows are into the wind. This allows them, as they move in this direction, just to touch up slowly when needed to keep themselves in the right place. The other thing that we would notice here is that when the wind is sideways onto a boat, that boat has a very big surface area in terms of the wind and will move very quickly as a result. When we are head on into the wind, that boat has a very small surface area in relation to the wind and actually moves more slowly. Okay, and so a lot, especially the junior crews, don't understand this very well, and the marshal can help by explaining this to them when they get there. Of course, we also try and get the coaches to explain this to them at the same time. Now, we have a situation at the start. How will it differ between a junior and under 14, under 15 regatta only and a senior regatta? So in a junior regatta, there are no crews coming from the 2,000 meter mark. So the marshal can get the crews and the rack and stack them all the way down the course for as long as we like. Of course, if the umpires are present, we would have the umpires between these crews here. And if this umpire here was waiting when we asked these crews to go in, we would say, please line up behind umpire 3 or whatever it happens to be. Importantly, leave enough space between these crews, leave enough room for final straightening before the start. So we don't want these crews right on the start because they're going to blow sideways before the aligner has time to bring them into place. What we also want is if the wind is from this direction, we want the crews to start lining up on the extreme right-hand side of their lanes and to even arrive at the start line in that position so that when the aligner is aligning them, the wind blows them back to where they want to be. Crews which are further back, should be angled into the wind like this, compensating for the wind. And they should be, here, this one, rowing perpendicularly onto the course and spinning into their lane. Right, so that's with this crosswind, what it would look like. What would it look like with a headwind? With a headwind, that's the wind coming from this direction, it would look very similar, except we wouldn't be getting the crews to stick to the right-hand side of their lane. They can stick to the middle of their lane. And as the marshal, we have to be careful of these crews all drifting further and further down the course this way. Of course, them heading into the wind like this aids with that because it's easy for them to stay in position, but especially with some of the junior crews, they aren't aware enough to keep themselves into position, and the marshal might have to chivvy them up and bring them closer to the start. So just be careful of that. Now, what would help? What would change with a tailwind? So in the tailwind, we've got the opposite problem. The wind is coming from this direction, and as we said before, especially with these junior crews, backing down is hard. So in that case, what we might want to do is not bring too many races onto the course. We might want to keep the crews in their race order, but keep some of them in this area here and only bring them on later on, so that we only have 2 or 3 sets of crews there. Otherwise, we'll get all of these crews concatenating up against the start. There won't be enough room for the crews to straighten before getting to the start and so forth. So what we're saying here, really from a marshalling perspective, it's really important for the marshal to assess the conditions and to control the crews, and marshal the crews according to the conditions and the crew's ability. Right. So what will change with a rolling start? Actually, very little changes with a rolling start, except that you might need a little bit more space between these crews, and the start line. But otherwise, all these principles remain the same. Right, so now let's look at a junior and senior regatta combined. In that case, we cannot rack and stack over here because there are races coming down from the 2,000 meter mark. So in that case, we're keeping our crews. Again, keeping the different races together and keeping them orderly in the holding area. And as soon as the previous race has gone by and the umpire has following it has gone by, we can get, as marshals, get these crews to come onto the course and straighten up and start moving towards the start. If there's 3 or 4 races from this area before the next 2,000 meter race, of course, we can get multiple crews onto the board to the water and so forth. Right. So with a head race, so I'm not sure whether we're going to have head races at the next regatta or not, or any time this season. But with a head race, the crews should boat in approximately race number order, and then they get onto the course in approximately race number order, with all the crews stringing out along the way. What's important is that the first crew leaves sufficient space before the start in order that the umpire who is controlling getting the crews to the start has space to be there and to call them in. And secondly, then from a marshalling perspective, to make sure that the crews keep moving up as they start going off, so that this line moves continuously. Right. Are there any questions with respect to the marshals? Oh, okay. So there is one. So Tanya has asked, with a head race, can you do a rolling start? So the answer to that is, with a head race, you only do rolling starts. Okay, so all the crews in a head race cross the start line at racing pace. You happy with that, Tanya? That's why we keep these crews away from the start line and that we have an official calling people up. But yeah, all the crews cross the line at racing pace. Some of them aren't aware enough to know that they should cross at racing pace, but if they want to take the shortest possible time to the finish, they'll cross at racing pace. Okay, right. So then let's move on to the starter. Now, very often, especially at the 1,000 meter mark, the starter's role is also performed by the umpire. But let's, for the purposes of today, I've separated the duties of the starter out completely, and then we will deal with the umpire later. So what does the starter do? Okay, so it's the starter who checks the WhatsApp for changes to crews and schedule. It's the starter who applies the 2-minute rule. So at the 2 minutes before the race, the crews should be ready to race. And we should be aiming to start at race time. And the starter would award yellow cards, which is a warning for crews that arrive after this 2-minute time gap, unless, of course, there are extenuating circumstances. So there was an equipment clash. One of the previous races left 15 minutes late. We've caught up a lot, but one of the boats in that race is being reused for our race, and the coach has gone to Control Commission and has asked for a hold on the race because of this equipment clash. It is not the crew's problem. It's not the crew's fault that that previous race went off late, and so then we would need to wait because of this. That is what we would call an extenuating circumstance. Another extenuating circumstance is like we had on Saturday. It was extremely hot. In circumstances when all the crews were at the start prior to start time, we let those crews go early in order to, for safety reasons and to ensure that the crews weren't in the sun for longer. That's necessary. Okay, and then the other thing the starter will do is it'll also inform crews that are carrying a warning into the race. So this might be a warning, a yellow card, which was awarded prior to the 2-minute time gap, and typically that would be for a traffic violation. So wandering onto the course, on the way to the start. But it could also be for something like weighing in late or something of that nature. So the starter should only start the race when the course is clear. The previous race has progressed sufficiently. So the last thing in the world we want is for our race or this race to row through the race in front of us. This causes an immense amount of pain in the finish tower, the judge at the finish, and also complicates the race going down. We might have to steer crews around other crews and so forth. Now that can always happen, of course, if somebody turns turtle 2/3 of the way down the course after the race has started and so forth. But that should be the exception, and we should do everything in our power to mitigate that happening by ensuring that the previous race has progressed sufficiently. Now, of course, again, there's judgment which we should exercise here. If we've got a single sculling speed race, following a quad A race, then those single sculls will never catch those quads, and we can start them relatively quickly. But on the other hand, if it's the reversed, if we've got a quads race immediately, and an A quads race immediately following a single scull C race, then we should wait until the crews are at least past the 500-meter mark, and maybe further than that, just depending on how slow the slowest sculler is before starting the race. Okay, and then all crews should be present if it's before the race start time. So we absolutely cannot set off a race early if all the crews are not there. And that includes races where that crew might not have checked out, hasn't left the jetty, etc. We cannot start the race before time if it's not there. All sorts of things could happen. The previous race could have a clash, and there's a at the 500-meter mark, and is brought back to the 1,000 for a re-row, and our race gets delayed. All sorts of things can happen. We cannot start a race on early if all the crews are not there. And then the final thing is that the starter assistant, which might be the umpire, which would be the pilot if the starter and umpire roles are combined, but the starter's assistant has completed calling in the race. So it's been called on the radio, and the finish tower has been given adequate warning that the race is about to start. Right, now, what happens if a crew suffers a breakage before the start? It's a very ambiguous area, and many people are not quite sure what to do in these circumstances. So what's useful here is to look at the rules.
Can my computer screen?
So what does the rule say? The rule says if a crew sustains any damage to its boat or equipment on the way to the start or in any designated holding area, the crew can bring this to the attention of the umpire. Typically, actually, it would be to the attention of the marshal. And after having examined the damage and in consultation with the president of the jury, the umpire shall decide on an appropriate course of action. And that appropriate course of action could be rejecting the claim, or it could be effecting repairs, or it could be delaying the start of the race in order to effect repairs where the damage is of significant severity. So what this means is that the umpire has to exercise discretion in determining what caused the damage. So of course, if the damage was caused because another boat rode into this boat and caused a problem with the boat, that is not the fault of the crew, or it might be the fault of the crew. You'd have to ascertain that. But if it's not the fault of the crew, then we have to allow the crew to repair. If the damage is minor and can be repaired before the race is due to start, and this happens, from time to time, especially with the marshal helping. We're giving as marshals, tools to the crew to fix something. Then there's not a problem there. If the damage is of such a nature that it would delay the start to the race, and it's the crew's own fault, in other words, the maintenance issues, things have come loose, and so forth, and it would delay the start, we could then reject the claim and say to the crew, this is a maintenance issue, you have to live by your own maintenance, please proceed back to the finish down lane 9 at Rudderplaat. Okay, so that's the damage prior to the start. And that is mainly, or that is the umpire's role to assess that. And if there's a delay to the start, obviously to communicate with the starter, in that regard. So what does the starter do? So the starter announces the race and marshals the crews and calls the crews. So what would that sound like in reality? So the starter, in speaking to the crews, would say, crews for race number 23, heat 2 of the junior woman 14 single sculls.
I had to ask his permission for that one.
Heat 2 for the junior woman 14 single sculls. Lane 1, St. Mary's Green. Lane 2, St. Andrews Jones, and so on and so forth. So in doing this, it's really important, to call the club, the stroke, and the lane number. If we just call lane numbers, then errors can occur because that same lane number is used in multiple races. So we call club, stroke, and lane number. The starter hands over to the judge at the start or the aligner, and in doing so, holds the flag, the red flag. The starter's flag is red, the aligner's flag is white. Holds the flag out at a horizontal position. And it's important here to hold that flag out at 90 degrees to the finish tower. Doesn't help the finish tower to see the flag if we hold it at a different angle. So we've got to give the finish tower the maximum chance of seeing that flag. Then thereafter, the starter waits for the aligners hold at all crews. And the starter checks that the crews are straight. There's no point in starting a race if the crew isn't straight. And in fact, even while aligning, the starter might judiciously tell a crew to straighten up. But if the crews aren't straight prior to the start, then we're likely to have a clash after the start, and that will lead to much more delays than the crew straightening up just before we let the crew go. Also, after hold it all crews, the starter does not need to take account of raised hands in the crew. Of course, it's good etiquette to check and inquire on raised hands prior to preparing for the race, but once we've got to hold it all crews, there's no need to check for raised hands. And yeah, the aligner training, which will happen next week, will deal with raised hands during aligning. Okay, so after the aligner has called hold it all crews and we're happy that the crews are straight, we raise the red flag saying attention, and again raise it in a way that is perpendicular to the line between the starter and the finish line, so that the finish tower, so the finish tower has the maximum chance of seeing it, but of course, also that the crews have maximum chance, of seeing it. And then after a 1 to 5 second pause, which should differ by race, we say go while lowering the red flag. If the aligner calls a false start or a clash occurs after the start and we need to stop the race, then we wave the red flag and call stop rowing. Okay, hopefully that doesn't happen too often, but it does happen from time to time. Right, now let's deal with Roodeplaat Dam at 2,000 meters, where the starter's role is separate to the umpire's role. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on this because there's been a great deal of confusion about it since we've had that start tower in place. So the first thing to realize is that what I wanted to show. So this is Roodeplaat. Yeah, here's the aligner station. Here's the start tower. Here are the white boys. Okay, so here's the actual situation which we will be involved in. So the first thing to realize is the umpire plays no part at the start, other than what we spoke about earlier. If there's a crew suffers damage prior to the start, the umpire is involved. But prior to the umpires, I mean the starter saying attention go, the umpire plays no role in the start. So we've had in past regattas, we've had umpires holding out red flags, we've had umpires handing over crews to the starter, etc., etc. None of that happens. The umpire should play no role in the start at all. It is handled entirely by the starter and the aligner. Okay, so the marshal still plays a role prior to the start, and the marshal will rack and stack the crews prior to these white boys. So in good place for the starters in the start tower here to be able to see and speak to the crews. Right, then at the appropriate time, so which would be no later than 2 minutes before the start of the race. It may well be before if time allows, soon after these crews, the previous race crews are moving towards the aligner. The starter calls the crews in the same way as we mentioned before. Crews for race number 63, etc., etc., etc. Tells them how many minutes to the start and awards any yellow or red cards in the same way as we spoke about earlier. So once the crews have been called, the crews will proceed in their lanes to the start side of the tower. In other words, they'll move from there to here. Once they get there and this race has gone off, the previous race has gone off, the The assistant starter will start calling the race in on the radio. The starter hands over to the aligner and holds out the red flag horizontally. Then, then everything proceeds as previously in terms of the alignment and the holding all crews, etc. Now, where might the umpire play a role? If there is no marshal or the marshal is busy with something else and the crews for the umpire's race are hanging back here and are not in the right place and so on and so forth, the umpire can assist by taking the role of the marshal. This is, so when I said here the umpire plays no role in the start, the umpire doesn't. But in the absence of the marshal, the umpire can assist by acting the role of the marshal. That is fine, and that's sensible and pragmatic. Then one other thing is that the umpire normally starts from behind the crew. So the umpire would come in here and be next to the start tower or just a little bit in front of it, indeed in front of the start tower during the aligning process. But if the umpires are still on the way to the start, and this sometimes happens, especially if one of the umpire boats breaks down, then we're short of umpires at the start, and the umpires are still on their way to the start. The umpire, after stopping in the middle of the course, well before and moving to the side and not making any wash and so on and so forth, can wait at the side of the course for the race to start. Now, for that to happen, this needs the agreement with the starter, and the umpire can't be too far down the course. So we would say no more than 100 meters. So at the 1900 meter mark is acceptable. So this saves the umpire coming all the way around here and to the back of the start tower, and that would save 1 or 2 minutes in terms of the start time. So that's just again sensible and pragmatic, and it has been happening quite regularly in recent regattas. Right, now let's just deal with the assistant starter, who's normally the pilot would be the pilot if the roles of the umpire and starter are combined. So the radio procedures are the responsibility of the assistant starter. So the assistant starter will announce the race. So it will call, the race number, the crew status, the umpire name, and so forth. So it would sound like this: POJ, judge at the finish, please stand by for the start of race number 43. All crews are present, or other than the green crew in lane number 4, which is a DNS, and the yellow crew in lane number 5, which is a scratching, and the purple crew in lane number 8 has been awarded a yellow card for late at the start. Umpire Jones bringing down the race and changing to channel 2. Then the assistant starter would change to channel 2. In the start tower, often we have 2 radios anyway, so that there would be a dedicated radio for channel 2. The assistant starter would announce again on channel 2. Now, if the aligning is taking a lot of time, then in order to protect the concentration of people in the finish tower, the assistant starter should announce stand down. So this would typically be if, for instance, the crews have got so badly out of alignment and out of their lanes that that the aligner has to back them down and start again. And then the assistant starter would announce flag up when the start is imminent. In fact, would probably also tell the finish that the crews are backing down, the start is going to be a little bit later, and so on and so forth. Then very importantly, and that's why it's in red, is to hold the radio open to transmit the start to the finish tower. So when the assistant starter starts hearing hold, the first word from the aligner of hold, it all crews, just open channel 3 immediately. And this is very important. It's very easy from the finish tower to miss the flag, and that radio is really important in ensuring that that the people in the finish tower have the best chance of capturing the start. And then what the assistant starter should also do is take a backup time with a stopwatch. And if the finish tower has missed the start, then the assistant starter can give the finish tower a countdown. So typically that would be, I'll count down to 1 minute, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 1 minute, and then the finish tower will start their watches on the 1 minute and add 1 minute to the times that they've got. Now, other things at the start, dress code. Dress code is controlled by the starter. So the first thing is the tri-suits must be the same. So you just need to be a bit careful when the uniform is changed. But the so we sometimes get a first crew rower or a second crew rower rowing in a first crew due to injury, and we've got slightly different tri-suits and so forth. We need to be sensible and judicious about that. Also, some of the poorer schools cannot afford uniforms, but you can give a warning as the starter, a yellow card for dress code violation. Hats, so rowers do not have to wear a hat, so you can have a crew with some rowers with a hat and some rowers without a hat, but those with a hat must all have the same hat. And the same goes for undershirts and leggings, and they must be a neutral color so as to not to compromise the racing uniform and make things difficult for the judge at the finish. And then finally, sunglasses are not controlled. Now the famous rolling start. So where conditions warrant it, so they're very tricky, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for the aligner to align crews statically at the start line. A rolling start can be employed. This can only be done where the umpire and starter's duties have been combined. So effectively a driller plot at the 1,000-meter mark. It's too difficult and dangerous at the 2,000-meter mark, and it's too complicated with the starter and the umpire. So, having different roles. So the umpire calls the crews to start. So they should start rowing prior to the start line, and in fact, well before the start line. And the umpire holds the red flag waist high to the side. So the same as if the crews were being aligned. The umpire instructs the crews that they must all row up together, and it's their responsibility to ensure that they don't cross the start line down from the other crews. The aligner calls the crews to catch up and slow down. When the crews cross the start line, the aligner, without stopping the crews, raises the white flag and shouts, "Prepare to race." It's not a hold it all crews, it's prepare to race. And then the umpire gives the command, "Attention, go." So raises the red flag and lowers it with no pause. And of course, we need to ensure that all crews are ready when we start the crews rowing, at the beginning of the rolling start. And the other really crucial thing is that all the heats in a particular race have to employ the same start. So if the first heat has gone off with a static start, all the other heats must use a static start. And if the first heat goes off with a rolling start, the umpire must inform the umpire of the next heat that a rolling start was employed, and the next umpire must also do a rolling start. Right, so that brings us to the end of the starter. Are there any questions pertaining to a starter? Okay, so the duties of officials aligner. So we're not going to be covering the aligner tonight. There is dedicated training for the aligner next week. So I'm going to move. I can get this thing to behave. Come on. Ah. Right. Sorry, we just had a technical gremlin there. So the duties of the officials of the umpire. So the umpire typically would start duties, except in those areas that we've spoken about before, but would start at the beginning of the race, either behind the crews or here on the start of the crews, or here behind the crews and here on the side. Doesn't really matter. Preferably behind, but on some courses it's not possible, and for reasons that we stated earlier, it's not always pragmatic to do that. So we already mentioned the start and umpire duties may be combined. The umpire is responsible for the conduct of the race. So it's responsible for everything pertaining to the race, other than those duties specifically allocated to the starter and the aligner, which we have just covered. And with those duties specifically allocated to the starter and the aligner, the umpire plays no role at all. The umpire needs to understand the traffic rules and the local rules as are published in the regatta notice and displayed on the venue. The umpire should check all the equipment and review the radio protocol. And as usual, the golden rule is the rower's safety is our main concern, and each competitor must be afforded an equal chance of winning. Next, with the umpire. Okay, so after the command go, the umpire starts participating, and after that, the umpire only uses a white flag. So the umpire uses a white flag unless the race is to be stopped. The other thing that's important for an umpire is don't if you're not using the flag, make sure that it's not visible. So so keep it out of the way. So the umpire should, after the go, immediately follow the crews in the middle of the course, cooperate and instruct the pilot on boat positioning, and ideally keep all crews clear from wake, even the laggards. The exception there is that if the laggards are so laggard, we will need as umpires to move up beyond the laggards, because we need to be close enough to protect the medalist and those that will qualify for finals or semi-finals. So there's no point in being behind the laggard if the laggard is 600 meters behind the winning crews, or and then we get a clash somewhere near the finish, and we as the umpires cannot see what is going on, cannot warn the crews, cannot do anything else. So a good deal of judgment and sensible judgment is required in terms of this. Ideally, we should prevent ourselves from washing crews, but it's not always possible. Okay, the next thing as far as an umpire goes is a crew is allowed to leave its lane. Okay, so there's no sanction on a crew leaving its lane, providing it doesn't interfere with other boats. So if that crew, when leaving its lane, is about to cause a clash with another boat or will interfere with another boat, then the umpire must tell that crew to move back. But if a crew leaves its lane and it's not a danger to the other crews and it's not interfering with another crew, then the umpire doesn't say anything to that crew. But that crew that has left its lane loses the protection of the umpire. So if another crew then comes and clashes with that crew, and that other crew would then obviously also be outside its lane, otherwise we would have warned the first crew as the umpire. If there are two crews both out of their lane and they have a clash, well, that's their problem. It's again not for the umpire to get involved with that. Right, and then the next thing is, as umpires, we don't steer crews, of course, unless that crews are likely to affect another crew, and that other crew is in its own water, or there's an obstruction. What do we mean by an obstruction? Well, a crew in the race ahead has turned turtle. Rescue is in the lane, helping to support that crew. And our crew is rowing towards it, we would need to steer that crew around it. Okay, if we've told a crew to stop rowing, we can tell them to continue by just, calling out their name and say continue rowing. If a crew is about to interfere with another crew, we will call that crew name and we will push the white flag shown here in the direction that we want that crew to go. And if there's two crews moving towards each other, so they're both moving towards the buoys, and that's both likely to clash there, and they've both been in their lanes, we can raise the white flag and say, keep apart. So we could say St. Mary's and St. Andrews, keep apart. And then finally, the umpire has to remember the safety of the crews and boats and take all steps, to ensure that safety. Okay, now we get to stopping a race. So if a fair race isn't possible, we stop the race by waving a red flag. We'll sound a siren or a bell. We'll call out stop rowing. We'll do whatever's necessary and make enough noise that all the crews stop rowing. Now, if a race has already started, we cannot restart the race except again at the start line. So typically the clash after the start or a clash, a third of the way down, we stop the race and we bring the crews back to the start. Now that might be immediate, or we might need to check with the POJ for a new start time. It depends what's happened. If there's been a clash and a boat is broken, and the boat that's broken is for the crew that didn't cause the clash, etc., etc., then we're going to need, to allow that crew to effect repairs, and we're going to need a new start time. Okay, so the other thing I would say is that it's preferable to stop a race if we are reasonably close to the start. And I'm talking now about several hundred meters into the race, rather than then wait for the finish. And then we end up with objections and all sorts of things which are very hard to deal with because the race hasn't developed sufficiently for us to form opinions about the finish orders of the crews. So if the clash arrives early, rather stop the race, take the crews back to the start. It solves a lot of later problems and unhappiness. Right, so now the race has finished. What does the umpire do? So firstly, look out for medical conditions. See if there's any hands raised. See if there's anybody lying down in the boat. If somebody's lying down in the boat, you ask specifically whether that person is okay. If they are okay, you tell them to sit up. And then if there is a hand raised, that would mean that there's an objection. And if there's an objection, then we do not wave the white flag to clear the race. Typically, if there's no objection, we can wave the white flag to clear the race. If there's an objection, or then we go to the crew to find out. Or if it was patently obvious to the umpire, even in the absence of a crew objecting, that the race was not fair, we can also intervene. And if that's the case, we hold up the red flag. And what does the red flag mean in that case? It means hold the result. Do not publish anything. It's the instruction to the finish tower not to publish. Hold the result. So if there's an objection, we go to the crew and we ask the reason for the objection. Now, it's very important to ask this because sometimes the objection is about something which we didn't expect. We think we know why they're going to object, but they're actually objecting to something else. So we can only deal with objections when we know what the crew is objecting about. And then we make a decision to uphold or overrule the objection. We advise the crew of the decision. In reaching that decision, we may need to consult with relevant officials. So, the crew might say that so-and-so jumped the start. Then, of course, we have to go to the aligner and say, did so-and-so jump the start, etc., etc. Okay. And then once we have reached the decision, we advise regatta control of the decision and the consequences of that decision, which might be something like a rerow and so forth. We can never ask the POJ for advice in reaching that decision. The reason for that is the POJ might need to deal with an appeal. And if one of the crews doesn't like the decision we've made after the objection, then they can appeal it, and then the POJ has to chair that group. And the POJ cannot have been involved in making the decision. So we never ask the POJ for advice. So once we reach the decision, we inform regatta control, we inform the finish tower, and we inform POJ. Right, so now let's deal with the pilot. So the pilot needs to be there early to get the boats on the water. That's less needed these days at Roodeplaat because everything is done for us. It's quite marvelous, actually. The pilot needs to ensure, though, that all their safety equipment is on board. Even though the helpers at Roodeplaat will put it there, you have to ensure that it is there and correct. The pilot, as the starter's assistant, should take a backup time if possible, and the pilot should be careful of wake. So in doing that, if you're returning to the start, you go up the course at full speed. You go up in the middle of the course. Why do we do that? Because then the wake dissipates evenly on both sides of the course. We come to a complete stop, no closer than 300 meters ahead of the oncoming race. We wait for the boat to settle, and then we turn off and we idle slowly off the course. And then we can also at idle go slowly up towards the start until the race has passed. The pilot is the umpire's second pair of eyes and hands. So if the umpire is looking at one thing and worrying about it, the pilot can help by looking in other directions as well. Pilot should be looking out for obstacles and traffic violations. Keeping an eye on the crew during the progression of the race and informing the umpire of concerns. Observe all hand signal requests or requests from the umpire and listen to the radio in case the umpire should be called. So the pilot is really the umpire's assistant. So this is what we were talking about in terms of stopping. So here's the race coming down. We've been going up in the middle of the race. We stop well ahead of the race. Once the boat is settled, so don't turn the boat at speed because you create a wake that goes all the way down into the oncoming cruise. We wait for the boat to settle and we turn off. Right. Now, the other thing to note as a pilot is that the wake from the motorboat comes out in a V. So if we look at that and we look behind the boat, we can see where that V is. It might allow us to be closer to the leading boat, and in fact even ahead of some of the other boats in the race without washing anybody. Then other things, if two motorboats are heading towards each other, then they both yield to starboard. In other words, both boats should turn right. When we're following another motorboat, we need to leave 100 meters between them. And then if two boats are converging at an angle, then the boat, the one boat will yield to the boat on its right-hand beam. So that would be this boat which would turn. If we have a capsized rowing boat, we notify rescue. And remember the priorities. Yeah, priority 1 is life-threatening. Priority 2 is important, but there's no need to stop to stop all racing. Yeah, priority 3 is get there as fast as you can. There's no life danger. So in determining that, the first thing to do is to count the heads and ensure that all the rowers are okay. If necessary, abandon your race. So you wait with the rowers, you make sure they're okay until rescue gets there. You help rescue if necessary. You must approach carefully. Disengage the propeller. There's no point in the umpire arriving or the pilot arriving here and then cutting up crew members with the propeller. If it's a dire emergency, there's a head missing, rescue some distance away, then dive in if necessary. And you can use the umpire's boat to stabilize the rowing boat while the crew gets in. Right, so now let's deal with objections. So we've already spoken about this to some extent. It'll be a raised hand to indicate to the umpire. The hand needs to be kept up until noticed, and then the umpire will make that decision on the water and communicate with the POJ in the way that we have spoken about earlier. Penalties that the umpire can impose. So it's a reprimand. So that's just telling the crew, you did bad, and next time, we'll treat it more seriously. A warning, which is a yellow card. So it's valid for the existing race only. And it will apply if the race is rerowed. And it is awarded for things like late at the start, dress code violations, traffic rule violations, and so forth. Exclusion, which is a red card, means you're removed from the event. You're late at the start, you get 2 yellow cards, you cause a clash during the race in a way that we'll talk about in a minute. Disqualification. So disqualification is a much more severe sanction because that's the removal of the crew from all events at the regatta, and that's every participant in the crew. So that disqualification can be applied for flagrant or intentional violation of the rules or false declarations of name, classification, or club membership. And then the final penalty is relegation to last place. That's if the boat is underweight. So an underweight boat isn't excluded, but it is relegated to last place. Right, so let's have a look at the rules of racing. So here we've got a finish line, we've got crews coming towards the finish line, we've got purple coming over this lane. What is likely to happen next? What's likely to happen is that these crews will clash, and then once they're clashed, because the oars on the side of the boat of the clash are stationary and the others can still move, that clash will get worse and these crews will come together. What should happen here? What should purple do? Purple should actually stop rowing. There is no upside, and we'll see this in a minute. There is no upside to purple to causing this clash. So, if purple causes the clash, the best they can do in that circumstance is come second in this race. if purple stops rowing, they can still win the race. And we'll see that in the example that comes up. So if you're in a crew that's about to cause a clash and you're out of your water, stop rowing and avoid the clash if you at all can. What should the umpire do? Well, typically the umpire would have already been holding out the white flag and instructing purple to move back into their lane. But prior to getting to the clash, the umpire can ask purple to stop rowing. Now, this is a very powerful weapon in the umpire's armory, the stop rowing. And it's much better to get a crew to stop rowing than it is to have to deal with a clash. Because once we've got a clash, we're going to have objections and all sorts of other unhappiness. And for the reasons what I've already said, if we can avoid purple clashing, then purple can still come first. But if we can't avoid purple clashing, then purple can at best come second in this race, and at worst, be excluded altogether. So, umpires, please make good use of the stop rowing command. So let's look at what happens if we do have an incident. So we've had an objection at the end of the race, and blue has put up their hands and they've said they were disadvantaged by purple. And now as umpires, we have to decide what to do. So the first question we ask is, has a crew been disadvantaged? So if a crew hasn't been disadvantaged, then the objection is of no consequence. So we overrule the objection and we say there's a regular race. Okay, then if there has been a disadvantage, but it hasn't affected the ranking of the obstructed crew. So there's been that's the question we ask, has the disadvantage affected the ranking of the obstructed crew? If the answer is no, again, we overrule the objection and we confirm the result. If there has been a disadvantage and it has affected the ranking of the obstructed crew, then we exclude the offending crew. Now, if by excluding the offending crew, then the chances of the obstructed crew are restored. In other words, the finishing order becomes correct again. If that's the case, we uphold the objection and confirm, and we exclude the crew and we confirm the result. If by excluding the crew, and that crew remains excluded, we have not restored the chances of the obstructed crew, then we have to re-row those crews whose ranking has been affected. Okay, so let's look at this in detail using an example. So we've got this blue and purple clashing here, just in the way that we spoke about earlier. So what happens if the finish order is purple, blue, red, green? Okay, so the first thing to ask is, has somebody been disadvantaged? And clearly here, blue has been disadvantaged. So we have a disadvantage. Okay. The second is, has the disadvantage affected the finishing order? Yes, the disadvantage has affected the finishing order, or potentially affected the finishing order, because blue might have won that race. So that one is also answered yes. So our step here then is to exclude purple. So purple is excluded and gets no position in the race at all. And we then see what the finishing order is, and in that case it would be blue, red, green, and based on these positions here, blue, red, green makes sense. Then we would finish with the objection and confirm the result. Okay, so that is one scenario. what happens if the finishing order is green, purple, blue, red? So in this case, we have a disadvantage, and that disadvantage has affected the crew rankings. Yes, absolutely, because blue has now come third. We exclude purple. By excluding purple, have we restored the correct finishing order? No, we haven't, because green has won instead of blue winning. So what do? We re-row green and blue. Okay. We no need to re-row red because green is already beaten red, so it's really between blue and green. What happens if the finishing order is green, red, purple, blue? So again, there's been a disadvantage. The disadvantage has affected the finishing order. We've excluded purple. That has not restored the correct finishing order. But in this case, because blue only finished third, we have to re-row green, red, and blue. And then finally, in this example, if the finishing order is blue, purple, green, red, so we ask the question, has there been a disadvantage? Yes. Has the disadvantage affected the finishing order? No. So therefore, we can just confirm the result as blue, purple, green, red. Okay, so when we look at these scenarios, what we see is if purple wins, purple is excluded. If purple comes second and green is first, purple is excluded. If purple comes third, but blue is behind them, purple is excluded again. So the best result that purple can aim for in these scenarios is to come second behind blue. So there is, going back to what I said about, it's in purple's interest to stop rowing and to avoid this clash at all cost. That's the way of ensuring that they can get the best result possible. Okay, so that brings me to the end. So I'll happily take any questions that anybody has, or any comments, or any improvements that anybody wants to say, or any corrections because I've made a mistake or anything else. Evelyn. Evelyn, please go ahead.
Evening, Craig.
Hi, Evelyn.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, and you?
Okay, yeah, that's an awesome training. Thank you. Really appreciate the time and effort that's required to put these training sessions together. And I know it's not easy to train a computer because there's no response coming back from anybody. It's so much harder than being in person. So I really do appreciate it. And yeah, I think hopefully everybody got a lot out of this training. And guys, if you really ask questions, if you want to ask questions, the newbies, you're not expected to understand everything straight off. And I know there's a lot to go through at this stage, but don't be intimidated. It'll all come together. And I always say, ladies, don't be scared to actually go out on the water. The water is a great place to be. So yeah, go out there and get the experience. It's really good to be at each point to understand the whole scenario. And yeah, thanks so much, Craig.
Thank you, Evelyn, for those kind words, and it's only a pleasure from my side. I see there is a question here, which says, are the uniform requirements the same for masters crews? So that's an excellent question. So if the crew is entered as a composite crew, so if it's entered as a, say, Wemmer Vikings or Wemmer VLC or something else of that nature, then the uniforms for the different clubs can all be present in the boat at the same time. Okay, good. And everybody, if anybody's got any questions afterwards, this chat is still open, or you can just approach me via the WhatsApp or whatever. I'm more than happy to answer them. Right, so everybody, thank you for your time and attention. I know it was a long session, but hopefully you got something out of it. And yeah, I'm here to help if you've got any questions. And that's what I look like.
Thanks, Craig. It was awesome.
Thank you, Craig.
But thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.